Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Connecting Dots podcast. As usual, I'm your host, Usama, and today we're joined by Shaiza Qayyum, who's based out of the Bay Area, and she's an applied science manager at Uber. So, with that, we'll get into how it is like being in her shoes and how's life in the Bay Area in general. So, with that, let's get started. Shaiza, I formally welcome you to the show. How had your day been so far?
Hi, thank you for having me on the show. My day's been pretty good. I guess for context for people who might be watching later, the Asia Cup was today and Pakistan was playing Sri Lanka. We lost pretty badly,
Yeah.
so that was a bit disappointing. But
Yeah.
that's okay.
Well, nonetheless, we're happy to have you on board. So, first of all, let's get started. That we're very curious to understand about what your role of applied science manager entails.
Sure. The applied science job category is actually defined very differently across different tech firms. So I'll specifically talk about Uber because applied science at Uber is specifically to define for people who work as either data scientist or applied scientist. Could be from
Mm-hmm.
backgrounds like economics, stats, or operations research.
Mm-hmm.
I'm personally in a team called Marketplace. So essentially, we have built Uber's marketplace. So we figured out how to set prices either on the driver
Mm-hmm.
side or on the rider side.
Yeah.
My role in particular is so I am the applied science manager for the pricing and incentives team. So my
Mm-hmm.
team is responsible for setting prices for Uber Eats, and we are like people from various backgrounds, but mostly they're economists and operations research and stats people who
Mm-hmm.
build models to set optimal prices and then experiment to find out how our models are doing.
Right. And also, I mean, you can decline to answer, but I'm really curious to ask you about, let's say, if we don't talk about Uber Eats in particular, how does surge pricing work?
So I guess the idea of surge pricing is to essentially set the price that clears the market. So it's about balancing demand and supply. So if you have more demand than you have supply, you would, as like just the basic econ principle would be to raise prices. That's essentially what surge pricing or dynamic pricing does. It tries to set the price which is going to clear the market
Mm-hmm.
and balance out supply and demand. So that's a very high level
Okay.
overview of how surge pricing works. So that's why you would see when you try and order in Uber,
Yeah.
they would say like right now we have limited drivers, which is why you might be facing an extra fare. So when you increase prices, what that does is it encourages more drivers to come online. It also suppresses demand. So that's how you balance demand and supply. So that's the market clearing price for
Mm-hmm.
that point in time.
Right. And the reason I ask you is that it might be, just because of my own, it's just a personal reflection, I would say, because when I was a student back in the days, like it's several years ago, so I was stuck at university. I wanted to go home, and it was a snowstorm that day. Typically, on normal days, it used to take me about $20 to go home from university. That day took me about $80.
Yeah.
So
So
that's why I'm like, like what the hell?
but probably a lot of people didn't want to drive during a snowstorm,
Yeah.
so you have to also pay a
Yeah.
decent wage to the driver who's coming to pick you up and drop you off.
Of course, no, I understand, and it does sound exciting about what you do. As far as your profession is concerned, I mean, it affects so many people across continents, and it must be exciting to work in such an environment too. But other than that, Shaiza, first of all, give us an elevator pitch about how your professional journey has been so far, and right now, what are the general expectations that you have of yourself?
Yes, that's a very loaded question actually. So I can just like sort of talk about my trajectory, sort of starting from PhD. So I was always interested in
Mm-hmm.
economics, even as an undergrad back in Pakistan, and then I came here for my PhD. I focused during my PhD on structural econometrics or applied microeconomics, essentially. So in
Okay.
so micro and macro are very different. Macroeconomics, as you can imagine,
Mm-hmm.
deals with trying to understand macroeconomics, versus applied micro is actually trying
Mm-hmm.
to understand human behavior at a very granular level. So I was always interested in that.
Mm-hmm.
And then after my PhD, I just got a chance to work at Uber, where I think it's just a dream job for economists, because you get to sort of build a marketplace, think about human behavior. The sort of
Yeah.
things that interest economists would be how people react to wages or prices, and that's exactly what I've been working on. So I have been just deeply enjoying the work that I've been doing for the past 3 years. I haven't really
Mm-hmm.
made big plans for the future, but I hope to be just continuously doing what I enjoy doing, which is working on these types of
Yeah.
problems. So
Right. Interesting. And if we don't talk about Uber in specific, how is it like living in the Bay Area, which is like the hub of innovation in the world? How's life like over there?
So that's interesting because actually I used to be on the East Coast. I lived in the DC area for about 7 years, and I moved to the Bay Area about 3 years ago. About 4 months
Mm-hmm.
after I moved, COVID sort of hit. So
Yeah.
we are quarantined for like more than 2 years. I don't think I really got to
Mm.
experience Bay Area the way that other people might have experienced the Bay Area. Having said
Yeah.
that, I think it's just I really enjoyed living on the East Coast as well, but the West Coast, and especially the Bay
Yeah.
Area, has been exciting because you get to meet a lot of people who are just continuous. So I've had a chance to meet a lot of people who are, really innovative, really smart, trying to build something new.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been quite exciting as well.
Nice. Interesting. So once you've started in the position that you're in right now, were there any myths that got busted for you?
I guess the general myth about data science or applied science in general is that it's a role which is very heavily focused on machine learning, which is true to quite an extent. Uh, but one thing that I realized is that there are different flavors of applied science. It's actually a lot more rigorous technically than I would have imagined. So I get to actually use a lot of the techniques I learned during my
Mm-hmm.
PhD, which I didn't think would happen in a work
Mm-hmm.
environment, especially in the private sector.
Yeah.
And then yeah, so and then I think, yeah, that was the biggest myth, that there's just not one flavor of applied or data science. There's multiple flavors, and that
Mm-hmm.
especially like coming from my field, there's a lot of value that we can add as applied scientists as well. So that would be, I guess, the biggest myth.
I just wanted to take it a little further and wanted to ask you about, again, your career in specific. But I mean, you had been an instructor in your career, and now that you're working in the field. But I mean, how, or do you think that being an instructor at some point in your life helped you in shaping your personality into who you are right now?
Yeah, so actually teaching or being an instructor really does help, uh, especially like in my job. I'm a manager right now, so I manage a team of 12 people. um,
Mm-hmm.
and they are like 12 people, from people who are just starting in their careers versus people who are slightly more senior as well. um,
Yeah.
Having been an instructor, I think one thing that really helps is you know how to explain complicated concepts in a way that's easy to understand. That's actually quite essential, because you would be working not just with people who are other economists or other applied scientists, but you'll be working with people who are
Mm-hmm.
engineers or product managers. So having those communication skills and being able to explain things in a way that's
Yeah.
intuitive, I think that's something that I learned just because I had the chance to either TA or actually be an instructor at Hopkins. And then secondly,
Mm-hmm.
as a manager, I think it's helped me because I can sometimes I just actually feel like for my reports, I'm
Mm-hmm.
more like a teacher, try to sort of teach them step by step how to think about the problem,
Yeah.
especially like the more junior ones, and help them sort of grow in their careers. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that communication and that sort of stakeholder management, all those aspects actually, I think that you have to face in a tech job.
Yeah.
They are something that I learned or picked up, some of the skills at least, when I was an instructor.
That's interesting. And if I were to connect this to you being a manager, because I've seen that you had a gradual hierarchy towards being a manager. So how do you think your life has transitioned once you're in this leadership position? I mean, if I were to ask you about prioritization in your life, so how would you reflect on that?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So I started off as an IC, an individual contributor. When you're an IC, you're sort of working independently
Mm-hmm.
on your project. You're consumed by your project, and that's how you're creating impact. That's
Yeah.
very different from when you become a manager.
Mm-hmm.
So the manager is judged
Mm-hmm.
not on how well they are doing individually, but how their team are doing.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
it was a mindset shift to just focusing on my project and making sure that I'm doing the best that I can, but also sort of shifting to how I can get the best out of the people who are working on the problems that my team handles. I also feel a lot of ownership towards my reports. I feel like I want to set them up for success. So I'm constantly
Mm-hmm.
thinking about identifying their strengths and then putting them in those projects where they would outshine others, and then also identifying their weaknesses so I can think about which projects they should be part of so they can grow professionally in their careers as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's thinking about different things, and all this while you also have to think about all the technical details. But there's, I think, added responsibility of making sure that you are growing the careers of people that you're managing. So and that's just very different from when I was an IC.
Yeah, interesting. Um, so, if I were to ask you about planning or setting your employees or even yourself up for success, do you think there are any healthy habits or any sort of metrics to gauge how well you're progressing? Like, for example, if I were to put it into perspective, so let's say you're like you set your goals for the next 5 years and then the next 5 years and so on and so forth. So, do you think there's some sort of rubric that people should kind of adopt in their professional lives to just assess how they're progressing well towards their goals?
So I think it's useful to set goals not for the super long term. So I for example, don't set goals for 5 years.
Okay.
Because I mean, who knows what I'll be doing in 5 years? Maybe I'll just quit everything and
Absolutely. Yeah.
open a
Yeah.
bakery. So I do
Yeah.
set goals for the short term, and not very
Yeah.
rigid goals, but like goals for the short term. This is what I want to do in the next. So let's say, you know, I have set a goal that I want to be at this level in a few years. For that to be achieved, I need to follow a certain set of steps, right? So it's helpful to
Hmm.
identify like short-term or medium-term goals that you can walk towards. So that's at least what I also tell my report. So you would have, you know, conversations about, okay, so what do you want to achieve in this half, for example,
Yeah.
and then we could and so this is true for myself, but I'm just generally talking about how I discuss this with my reports as well. We would identify, okay, these are the areas of opportunities, this is where you can grow, and this is, if you know, you combine all of these things, you will ultimately be able to achieve your goal. And then you keep tracking how you're doing towards achieving that goal. And if you're tracking behind, then you need to uh, improve on certain dimensions. If you're tracking really well, then you know that you're going to hit your goal, and you can actually, you know, overachieve as well. So that's just generally how I would think about setting goals. I don't think you
Hmm.
have to be too rigid about it. There has to be a
Yeah.
balance between setting goals and also ensuring that you don't lose your sanity.
Hmm.
So you need to obviously strike a healthy balance between being very goal oriented
Yeah.
versus also making sure that you're happy and healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm also, it's maybe one of my favorite questions to ask people who are based in the Bay Area, that uh, there's a certain aspect of life that's called your professional life, what you do for a living that keeps you going, but then there's another chunk of the pie that's dedicated towards your family. You have to split your time between your different priorities. So when once you are a part of such a thriving environment, how do you think one should maintain a healthy work-life balance so that they're not neglecting their family and they're not really neglecting their work either?
Yeah, so as a PhD student, actually, I felt that when I joined the workforce, my work-life balance improved drastically, because as grad students, or at least as a grad student, I was continuously working. I was continuously working on my dissertation and thinking about my dissertation. There were no weekends. There was no after 5 p.m. you stop working. So I felt like in that
Yeah.
ways my life improved. Having said that, like it's as you're
Yeah.
working as well, like sometimes I would be thinking
Yeah.
about work problems at night, which is like not healthy. And then I have to check myself that
Hmm.
I'm not taking away time from my husband or my son, who's 3 years old. And so just sort of making sure that you have boundaries and you're not bringing work home and you're just
Hmm.
not constantly tense about it. And even while you're at work,
Yeah.
sometimes, you know, you have like a big project that you have to deliver. And things might not be going
Hmm.
well and you have to push out deadlines. It's not the end of the world. So that's what I keep telling
Yeah.
myself, or you know, people who work in my team. The good thing is we're not doing some, like, we're not brain surgeons that if we stop the surgery right now the person is going to die. So most
Exactly.
likely
Yeah.
it's the case that whatever it is that we're working on, if the experiment analysis doesn't finish or is slightly wrong, nobody's going to die and Uber is not going to go bankrupt. So it's okay if you know, make a
Yeah.
mistake. um,
Exactly.
so that's why
Exactly.
that sort
Yeah.
of, you know, helped it, at least in my head, relieve some of the pressure. And then some people actually are really good at maintaining that boundary. Like after 5 p.m. they do not
Hmm.
take calls, they do not take meetings, they do not even respond to Slack messages, which I think is really healthy. I still have to
Yeah.
actually I still think about work after 5 p.m. and I'm actually sometimes working as well, but that's something that I have to just improve over time.
Yeah.
Also, part of the reason is, the reason why I'm actually thinking about work after 5 p.m. or sometimes on weekends is because I really enjoy what I'm doing. So it doesn't feel like
Hmm.
work. So that is also something
Yeah.
that blurs the boundary between work and personal life.
Right, interesting. So now again, being a manager, do you have any cool traditions within your team?
We don't have traditions as such. What we try and do is
Mm-hmm.
every quarter, for example, we get a budget for just like team building events, etc. So I try and make sure that we
Mm-hmm.
have some team building events every quarter. So there would be, usually there's like end of year parties, but even other than that, we had recently a team building exercise where we played like virtual escape room, and that was because of
Yeah.
COVID. Or you could, go bowling,
Mm-hmm.
etc. So we just try and do that. Whatever
Mm-hmm.
other, so whatever everybody wants to do, we like usually run a poll with multiple options. People choose what they want to do, and then we go and sort of do it. But yeah, that's what I do on my team, at least. There's
Yeah.
no tradition as such.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And one last question, maybe in the chain of these career related questions, that um, what do you think would be traits of a successful manager or slash leader?
So a successful manager is somebody who can create impact for, so your team is responsible for, like my team is responsible for pricing and incentives. Ultimately, we are gauged on how well our models are doing in creating business impact. So that's the first OKR or metric that we look
Mm-hmm.
at. But then as a manager, the other success criteria is that how well you are uh, communicating with your stakeholders, so your engineering partners or your product partners, and then how happy your team is. So if you have an unhappy team, they would be unproductive, and you would not be creating the
Mm-hmm.
impact that you could if you had a happy team. So if people are not, they don't have a good work life balance, if they're working too hard, there's going to
Mm-hmm.
be burnout, etc. So you have to make sure that you have built a relationship with your team, that if there's any problem, your team comes and talks to you, and then you can go and resolve those issues for them. So I think that's key. Also, being able to build trust with your reports is really important. That's one of the things that I learned
Mm-hmm.
was extremely important when I started off as a manager. Um, because if they don't trust you, they won't come and talk to you about problems. And if you can't figure out
Yeah.
their problems, then there's going to be unnecessary attrition.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just more work for you than finding people to replace the folks who have left. So I think, yeah, building
Mm-hmm.
trust is most important, and all of that sort of works toward ultimately creating business impact.
Excellent, excellent. And now, Shaiza, if I were to be talking to Dr. Shaiza instead, so I want to ask you about your journey through academia. So, how well do you think academia is aligned with what the industry expects?
Um, for econ in particular, I think there are some departments in recent years that have done a really good job preparing people not only for academic jobs but also for tech jobs. Um, but I did my PhD in 2018, so like about 5 years ago. I don't
I mean,
know,
it's not that long ago
but
either.
even then, I think I don't know
Yeah,
if at least my department was actually preparing people
yeah.
for tech jobs in particular. So in
Mm-hmm.
econ specifically, the type of, so there were, when I went on the job market, there were either academic jobs that you could apply to, or there were these non-academic jobs which were usually at like think tanks, or you could go
Yeah.
and join litigation consulting or some sort of
Mm-hmm.
consulting. That was the only option. I actually, and maybe this was just like a miss on my part, but there was no preparation that people that our department had us go through to prepare for tech jobs. And tech jobs in
Mm-hmm.
particular are very, very different from all the other types of jobs. um, so
Yeah.
so academia sort of prepared me in the sense that tech jobs, actually some of the jobs like Uber, Amazon, etc., they're very rigorous in their interview process. So if you're really rigorous during your PhD, then you're able to sort of cross that. But that requires
Mm-hmm.
some preparation, and it's helpful if you have someone who tells you what the interview process is going to look like and how you can prepare for it. I don't think I had that
Mm-hmm.
when I was a grad student, but I know for a fact that over the years people have like a lot of departments have actually they support people going into non-academic jobs and not just pushing people towards academic jobs. And they're actually so in your last year as a grad student, departments usually set up mock interviews, for example, and they try and prepare you for what the interview
Mm-hmm.
process would look like for academic jobs. They have also started
Mm-hmm.
doing that for tech jobs now.
Right, interesting. And now, if we just particularly talk about being a student at school and then preparing yourself for working in the industry. So, in your opinion, what should students be doing more of to set them up for success, or success in a way that they should be landing the jobs that are really good use of their skills?
So that depends on what sort of industry jobs people are looking at. But one thing that I think just is helpful if you have really good coding skills,
Mm-hmm.
because I think in most jobs, just having better coding skills than the average is going to help you out. Having good communication is also really important. So if you're not able to communicate
Mm-hmm.
your ideas, it's very difficult in any type of job to be able to function and be successful. So bad communication at some point becomes career limiting. So
Yeah.
that's what I would focus on. So just like practice talking about the work that you're doing. So if you're a grad student working on your dissertation, you have multiple opportunities of presenting your work and getting feedback. So I think people should just use those opportunities to present as much as possible, practice their
Mm-hmm.
presentation skills. It helps them clarify the concepts that they're thinking of in their own heads, but also helps them think about how to best communicate them to people who have never thought about that problem. And that's going to be
Yeah.
helpful in any job that you work at.
So one last thing, if I were to talk about academics right now, so I'm really interested to understand about your thesis topic. So what was your research on, and how do you think it really factored in your current work?
So my thesis actually was, I was doing structural econometrics, which is like estimating dynamic sort of discrete choice models with a focus on labor
Mm-hmm.
and health economics. So my job market paper, like my main paper, was actually estimating a model of female labor supply and child ability production function, which is very, very different from what I'm doing for a living today. So
Okay. Yeah.
essentially, the idea was to try and understand if you want to send your kid to a private school, which is
Mm-hmm.
more expensive, versus sending them to a public school. You need more money. So do
Mm-hmm.
mothers in particular work more if they want to send their kids to private school? So is there a causal relationship between wanting to send your kid to a good quality school, which is more expensive, versus not? So there are multiple. So essentially, it was trying to understand multiple trade-offs that mothers face in their labor supply decisions. So this was like a complicated dynamic model of
Mm-hmm.
you start working or thinking about how much you're going to work before your child is born, and then there's specific patterns in the data that you could see. So in the data that I was using, I saw that mothers who sent their kids to private school ultimately worked more before the child was born. And then this is a very well-known pattern for female labor supply. Once you have a child who's
Mm-hmm.
born, your labor supply goes down. It sort of remains down for the first 5 years of the child's life, because a lot of
Mm-hmm.
and there's a huge literature on the child development side as well, which
Mm-hmm.
shows that the first 5 years of a child's life are the most important in terms of making investments, both time
Yeah.
investments and monetary investments. So you could see that mothers spend less time at work when their child is between 0 to 5 years of age. But then
Mm-hmm.
what I saw in the data was that you mothers started picking back up on labor supply or work after the child was 5 years of age. But that pattern sort of reversed between private and public school mothers. So private school mothers worked more
Mm-hmm.
before the child was born, but less afterwards. So that was sort of the
Mm-hmm.
pattern that I was trying to explain. There are multiple factors that could explain that. How much income are you getting from your husband's work, etc. How much do you prefer working versus how much do you prefer spending time with your child? If you spend time with your child, how that affects their ability or cognition. So there were
Yeah.
like multiple things that you sort of needed to factor into your model and then ultimately estimate that. So that is basically what my job market paper was about. My second paper was estimating demand. So specifically the question
Mm-hmm.
was, how do reviews for certain products, specifically I was focusing on HIV drugs, how do like reviews
Okay.
published in a magazine affect the demand for those drugs? So you can imagine that when you
Mm-hmm.
make decisions about so when you have to decide whether or not to buy a product on Amazon, you sometimes go and read reviews. Or if you want to decide whether to
Mm-hmm.
watch movie A versus movie B, you can go and rely on
Yeah.
reviews. But the question that we were trying to answer is, do actually people rely also on reviews for a decision as important as which HIV drug to consume or like to use? So that was the question that we were sort of trying to study.
Yeah.
Um, uh, Broadly speaking, I think both of these papers were actually
Yeah.
just like some sort of discrete choice
Mm-hmm.
modeling, but a focus
Mm-hmm.
on different sort of topics.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I mean, both of your topics are really, I would say, relevant, and they sound interesting to me as well. And especially, I've been talking to a lot of young parents as well, and I've seen the common pattern. Yeah, that the initial few years of your relationship building with the child are really important. That's interesting. So, other than that, what are some of the core values that you believe in and you uplift in your life?
Um, I guess core values would be just sort of keep working hard, and then make sure that you cause no harm to other people. You keep working hard, and
Mm-hmm.
I just strongly believe that if you work hard, there's you always get rewarded for it. So like during my
Mm-hmm.
uh, PhD as well,
Mm-hmm.
I felt like especially like I think from my university there were very few girls who came
Mm-hmm.
to do a PhD. So I felt I
Mm-hmm.
would see their Facebook updates doing all sorts of stuff while I was, I don't know, doing proofs for theorems, and
Yeah.
I didn't know
Yeah.
why I was
Yeah.
doing all of that with myself. So I spent like my 20s sort
Yeah.
of holed away in my apartment, my studio apartment, and sort of working really
Mhm.
hard, I think. But I think it was good. Like I finally see the reward for it, and I'm glad for everything that all the various paths that I took, which led me to where I am right now. So I'm very grateful. But the key thing is that yeah, you just keep working hard and don't complain too much.
Yeah, that's cool. And kudos to you as well. I mean, not that you're a shining star at what you're doing, but you're also a parent as well, and that's a supreme amount of responsibility on your shoulders. And yeah, I'd really appreciate that. So other than that, I wanted to ask about uh, about a little bit about mentorship. That once you're done with your work, I mean, once you're in university, there's still a structured route that you can take, and eventually you're going to be ending up with a graduation of with a certificate or a diploma, whatever. But once you're at work, I would say that if you're not really conscious about your career journey and progression, 5 years are going to go by, and then you're like, where did time go? So in that regard, how do you think mentorship plays a role in someone's professional development? And how at working at these big tech companies, how easy do you think is access to senior people for mentorship?
So at Uber specifically, I think it's really easy to get access to senior mentorship. It actually quite encouraged. So uh,
Mm-hmm.
my manager, for example, he recently joined Uber from Amazon, and the first thing that he told me when he joined was like,
Mm-hmm.
make sure that you have a mentor and make sure that all the reports on your team have mentors. And I think that's sort of really important. So
Mm-hmm.
you can go and talk to your manager, but there's only certain types of things that you would talk to your manager about, right? But to
Yeah.
grow in your career, you can have that like informal casual relationship with the mentor, which is really important. You might want to talk
Mm-hmm.
about some technical details that you're stuck on. So there's
Mm-hmm.
so as an economist, for example, if I wanted to jam about certain topics, there are very senior economists at Uber that I can go and
Mm-hmm.
easily talk to. Their door is always opens. Also
Yeah.
similarly, if I want to talk about career progression, there are people that I can go and talk to who can help me figure out like how should I approach progressing in the um, on the career
Mm-hmm.
ladder at Uber. So I think I
Yeah.
highly encourage everybody on my team to have a mentor. I am personally a mentor for a couple of people as well, and I also have mentors who have helped me be successful at Uber to the extent that I am. So yeah, I think it's really important to have a mentor. The other thing, actually, I don't know if that was going to be a
Mm-hmm.
question, but I would also say, like you do your graduation, etc., and you are you are the expert in your field to at that point in time, but then the field is also changing very rapidly, and especially if you're sort of, let's say, working
Correct.
in
Yeah.
applied science, there are going to be different methods, different types of things that you need to keep on learning. So
Mm-hmm.
I also and Uber generally also encourages that you keep abreast of all the latest research, or like be at the frontier of research and apply those techniques at work. So you can go and attend conferences, you can go and talk to senior people or academic people in those conferences. uh,
Mm-hmm.
I personally follow econ Twitter and ML Twitter very closely, so I actually get to learn a lot of relevant papers that I've actually used on my teams in like the modeling approaches that we take as well. So
Yeah.
that also helps in keeping abreast of everything that's happening, even though you are not a student anymore.
That is excellent. That kind of answered my other question as well. That how do you keep up with the latest trends in technology? And the reason is that it is very relevant to understand the importance of upskilling yourself constantly, because there's something today which might be obsolete by the next year, and in this rapidly changing technical landscape, it's really important for that. But I mean, other than that, now that we are heading towards the end of our conversation here, and with that, I want to ask you about your journey. As a person, what you did your education, a major part of your education from Pakistan, then you moved abroad for your higher studies, and now, mashallah, you're working there. So, how had this overall journey been for you? How was it like being in one country then another? How was this experience for you?
So my experience, so overall, like as I said in a previous answer as well, like I'm really glad of the path that I took to be where I am. Having said that, while I was on that journey, I think it was quite difficult. So especially, I did my undergrad at LUMS, and then I worked at the Center for Economic Research in Pakistan for about 7-8 months, and then came to the US for my PhD. So when you suddenly coming from LUMS, and I mean, I live like 5 minutes away from LUMS as well, right? So it was literally just like
Yeah.
I was coming from home and then thrust in an environment where with a cohort of like 12 people. The PhD cohort is very small, and especially was very small at Hopkins. And so I was in Baltimore, and I had that studio apartment that I was living in. Didn't really know
Yeah.
anybody around me, not many Pakistanis around. There were like 6 people from China in my cohort who all sort of hung out together in the first year. And yeah, one Vietnamese person, one person from Honduras, and 2 people from the US. So I felt very lonely. It was quite lonely actually.
Yeah.
It was also really hard. So I just thrust myself into making sure that I'm studying and I'm doing properly in like my first year and second year. You have to pass your comprehensive exam, so that was like my focus. But it was very lonely. It was quite difficult, and especially like coming from Pakistan, where as I said, like LUMS was 5 minutes away. I knew the people that I was studying with, since some of them since like we were like 5 years old, and then to suddenly come to a place where I knew no one.
Yeah.
So it's quite a lonely path. So you have to create your network, and it becomes hard. So I had a tough time sort of just adjusting to this new world, where also like in Pakistan at least I wasn't used to doing everything for myself and studying. So now suddenly you're studying, making sure that you understand everything that's going on in class, and also you have to come home, cook, make sure you're cleaning your clothes.
Absolutely.
And everything is
You
done.
gotta live, right?
You gotta live. Yeah, you have to do grocery shopping. So all of that was a little bit of an adjustment. But yeah, I think over the 6, so then you start making friends, you start having a network over here. You need to have a support system in the US, especially when you're alone. And I find that it's actually not very hard to find a support system. There are other people who are in the same boat. I remember when I was 6 months in, so first year still, and my cohort mate from the PhD, he was somebody from China, so his name was Chang. So me, Chang, and another guy from the cohort, we were all sitting in a restaurant. We were talking about how difficult the first 6 months were, and like I remember like Chang saying, yeah, he used to go back home from the university and cry because he was so lonely. And I was like, you should have told me. I was doing the same. We could have cried together. So sometimes you just don't reach out for help, etc. It's but ultimately you form those contacts, etc. So yeah, I finally was able to create a network, and then things got easier since. And now, alhamdulillah, I have like a family, as you said. So and there's like all the people who I work with, etc. So I don't feel lonely for quite some time now, and that now finally feels like home to be in the US rather than just thinking about home as Pakistan.
Exactly. Yeah. Now that we're reaching the end of our conversation, honestly, I had a great time talking to you today. Let's wrap it up at this point. That knowing what you know now, would have been something that you would have done differently in your life.
I wouldn't say I would have done anything differently. I think everything that you do is meant to happen that way. One thing that I did learn, as I was, and we were just talking about my experience coming from undergrad to directly into a PhD program, I did feel that I think a slower start to adjusting to a new country is like if you come for your masters and then you adjust to or
Mm-hmm.
acclimate to that environment and then do a PhD, that would have been helpful. Especially like when I came for my PhD, my sister actually came for her master at the same time. I don't think she had that tough a time adjusting because there was like a big
Yeah.
cohort of like master students. So
Mm-hmm.
one thing that I wish I had done differently is if I had come for maybe a master's program instead of just thrusting myself into a PhD with a very small cohort. But that's a
Yeah.
minor thing. Other than that, actually, I'm pretty happy with the way that things sort of
Mm-hmm.
turned out. I didn't waste 2 years in a master's. I directly came for a PhD, so
Yeah.
I got where I am faster. One thing I would have told myself is like sometimes I used to get really frustrated. I used to get depressed or where if I wanted a job and I didn't get that, I would get really depressed. Especially like
Yeah.
I remember when I was on the job market, there were like 4 or 5 jobs that I had I reached the final stage of the interview and I just didn't make it. And I remember there was this one job where I didn't get it and I actually cried about it because I thought that I was really close.
Yeah.
But then like
Mm-hmm.
about 2.5 years late 3 years later, like last year, I was interviewing somebody while sitting at Uber from the same company, and he was trying to change his job because he was so unhappy at that place. And at that point I
Mm-hmm.
realized that that job that I was crying about, that was a blessing in disguise that I didn't get it, because had I gotten that, I wouldn't be where I am, and that would probably have been a bad job
Absolutely.
for me.
Yeah.
So that sort of made me
Absolutely.
realize that
Yeah.
whatever happens happens for the best, and you don't know what when it's happening because you just are very short term
Yeah.
targeted towards getting that job. But God has better plans for you, so you should sort of just trust that.
And with those pearls of wisdom, Shaiza, we'll close the conversation here. I honestly had a great time talking to you today, and hopefully our audience are going to have a good time listening to the conversation as well. As far as our audience are concerned, do check us out on other streaming platforms. And if you like the content, please do like, share, and subscribe. And that way, show your support for the channel and the work we're doing. And until the next episode rolls out, take care of yourself, and we'll see you soon. Bye.